It is my honor to introduce our commencement speaker, Dr. Preeta Bansal. I can only give a few highlights of her career here because if I did the whole list, there would be no time for her speech. So this is the Reader's Digest version. She's a magna cum laude graduate of both Harvard Radcliffe College and Harvard Law School. She served as a law clerk to Justice John Paul Stevens of the United States Supreme Court. Her public service work includes serving as the Solicitor General of the state of New York and in both the Clinton and Obama administrations. She was a leader of President Obama's Advisory Committee on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, focusing on poverty and inequality in America. She now devotes her time to civic and philanthropic endeavors, spiritual practice, and grassroots network models of change. She is deeply and actively involved in both Service Space and United Religions Initiative. She's been profiled by the New York Times as a poised and playful superstar and nimble, unorthodox thinker. We are so grateful that she has taken time from her busy schedule to talk to us today. Dr. Bansal.
Okay. Thank you so much, President Susan Rounds, and to the distinguished faculty and board of DRBU. And a special thanks to many dear friends who are part of this community and who have been shining lights for me for the past decade and more. But above all, warmest congratulations to all of you, the class of 2023. I think you passed the virtue test in your words. Thank you. And to the families, the friends, the ancestors, and the loved ones near and far who both set in motion and nurtured the ripples that allow us to be here today. So I know it's customary for someone who's standing here in front of you to pretend, or at least attempt to offer, some stories of wisdom gleaned from a lifetime of experience. It's true that I've both toiled and found tremendous joy and reward in various material realms of our society, from public service to the corporate world, I suppose, human rights diplomacy, academia, nonprofit work, and the voluntary service sector. But rest assured, I'm not going to do any of that. The truth is, I and others like me who have walked the realms of so-called external and societal power have so much to learn from each of you. It's you who have had the foresight as well as the insight to step off the beaten path and to choose to study at a remarkable institution like this, an exceptional incubator of wisdom and virtue. It takes a very special kind of person, deeply grounded in himself or herself, not to mention clear and courageous in your conviction, to seek out such a unique institution, while still relatively young in life. A place where the wisdom and the great books of both the East and West are studied. A place where learning is focused on self-discovery and knowing yourselves as much as it is on pointing outwards to outer forms of knowledge. And a place where theory is deeply integrated with practice so that learning becomes embodied learning. I have to say, when I was preparing for this, I looked over the curriculum and my mouth just dropped, my jaw dropped. I was like, wow, if only I could do this. It's a rare place indeed, and hardly the norm, as we all know, in conventional institutions of higher learning. Not to mention, I have to say, a place where the roads are named Compassion Way, Protector Avenue, and Filial Avenue. Oh my. And where I've learned you can be a student, a lunch pickup driver, and a dishwasher and a farmer all in one day. Or where peacocks and sheep seem to leisurely roam. The truth is, it has taken me a lifetime of experience to realize the wisdom that you graduates here today are blessed to have received early in your lives. Ancient wisdom that was transmitted through the Venerable Master Hua, who famously and pithily recounted, off by an inch in the beginning, off by 10,000 miles at the end. Off by an inch at the beginning, off by 10,000 miles at the end. These are words that Christopher Columbus might have benefited from back in 1492 when he missed India by nearly 10,000 miles. And I wonder what that says about the scope of our compounding trajectory 530 years later. But luckily, the NASA engineers working on getting Apollo 13 back to Earth from new explored terrains weren't off by an inch in their calculations. Truly, though, never has Master Wa's wisdom been more critical than today in terms of our internal alignment. As you exit the sacred environment where you're encouraged and supported to constantly be aware of and to align with your center and your own conditions, where you're encouraged to veer off those, not even by an inch, you may well be entering environments where there is little or no time for that kind of careful internal discernment and calibration. And the hard reality is that you may not even notice it. Because the thing about being off by an inch is that we most often don't feel the misalignment until it's too late to make a quick course correction. It's not like a situation of being a fish, that's being a fish out of water, where we immediately jump up and realize that we're not being true to our nature. It's more like being the frog in water that is slowly heating up. We can end up being burned alive without realizing it. That has certainly been my experience working in the big, complex institutions of our modern era. Fresh on the heels of America's successful Apollo 11 mission and the moon landing in 1969, the educational institutions for my Generation X, at least the conventional ones that I partook in, encouraged us to think big and shoot for the stars. We were taught to believe in the power of reason, science, and the analytical mind to break down, debate, and solve massive problems. It was an overwhelming belief in the power of the mind, an abiding faith that we can think our way through any complex social problem, much like the artificial intelligence of today, I might add. And so with a certain intellectual toolkit, I went on to have a bit of a moonshot career. It took me to the United States Supreme Court, to the White House, and to diplomatic, legal, and corporate roles around the world. But then something happened to upend and disrupt the coherence of my trajectory. I felt keenly the limits of the toolkit of the mind to address increasingly complex problems of a certain massive scale, at least without doing a good amount of collateral damage along the way. Because when you're working on a piece of legislation that takes more than 2,200 pages, or working for a corporation operating in 83 countries, or working on causes and issues that can go viral globally almost overnight, the idea that you can map or fully anticipate cause and effect through your mind alone seems pretty far-fetched. That's true at the apparent level, and even more so at the subtle or root level. Working on issues that can affect 100 million or 1 billion people, as happens daily now on Silicon Valley or Wall Street, Washington and London, and other elite power centers, may sound impactful and well-meaning, except that there's no way you can be in relationship with 1 million or 1 billion people. And there's no way you can ultimately find out how did that work out for you anyway. In an era of exponential technology and change, where institutional mottos include things like, move fast and break things, or where BHAGs, or big, hairy, audacious goals, are celebrated, I became keenly aware of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And while that certainly doesn't, support failing to act, it does counsel humility and some conscious awareness about the scope and speed of our actions, and our sense of alignment with our own conditions and internal guidance, a near impossible task for actions at a certain massive global scale. So off by an inch in the beginning, off by 10,000 miles in the end. Consider the recent news about Dr. Geoffrey Hinton, who went from being an artificial intelligence pioneer to a conscientious objector because things felt off for him by more than an inch. He and two of his grad students had created the technology that was really the underlying piece of AI's intellectual foundation. They did this in 2012, and they received for it the Turing Prize, which is kind of the computational world's version of the Nobel. But last month, he quit his job at Google, where he has worked to become one of the most respected voices in the field, so he can freely speak out about the dangers of AI. Dr. Hinton is someone who always had the internal tools to recalibrate his work with his inner conditions throughout his professional life. In the 1980s, he actually left his professorship at Carnegie Mellon University because he didn't want to take Pentagon funding. In 2012, Google acquired his company that he started with the two students after they made this discovery in 2012. And while he felt Google was a good steward for the technology for a decade or so until last year, careful because he thought it was careful not to release it to something that might cause harm, he realized that the tech giants now are locked in competition that might be impossible to stop, and so he quit. Off by an inch in the beginning, off by 1,000 miles in the end. A part of him, he said, now regrets his life's work. But he also said, I console myself with the normal excuse. If I hadn't done it, someone else would have. But because of his internal tools that allowed him to continually recalibrate to his conditions, he's now in a position where he can speak freely about the risks of AI with knowledge and authority. Or consider the more complex case of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who felt a deep obligation to join the American war effort. He believed that stopping fascism was a matter of saving civilization itself. He was appointed leader of the Manhattan Project in early 1942, though he understood immediately the truly destructive power of the atomic bomb. After the war, Oppenheimer was deeply concerned with the successful control of nuclear energy, and he sharply opposed the further development of the hydrogen bomb. Enough so that due to his views and his continuing political involvement, his security clearance was revoked in 1954. While he in part said he regretted his role as the father of the atomic bomb, he also refused to be paralyzed by the complexities of the matter. As reflected in his recitation of the verse from the Gita when the bomb was first deployed in Hiroshima, he realized at some level that he, like Vishnu on the battlefield, was doing his duty as he had become death, the destroyer of worlds. So was this a case of off by an inch in the beginning, off by 10,000 miles at the end? Who knows? None of these examples that I'm offering you are really meant to suggest any absolute sense of right or wrong action. Every action in every unique context, and by each unique person with their own conditioning, has causes and effects that we can't control or predict. And what's right for one person may not be ours to do, and vice versa. As the famous parable of the Chinese farmer who brought home the wild horse illustrates, good thing, bad thing, who knows? And as Vivekananda said, we kill thousands of living microbes every nanosecond as we draw breath. And so the notion that we must do no harm is a recipe for paralysis, or reflects a lack of clear discernment about what we do every day. It even can create a vacuum which other people inevitably may fill, doing the same work, but possibly with less awareness and fewer conscious boundaries. Nevertheless, we each are called to continually evaluate our work, not by its impact, but by our sense of joy and internal alignment with it, and to recalibrate what's off by an inch for each of us. In many sectors and institutions, though, forces that precede and succeed us, that inch can easily get closer to the 10,000 mile mark before we're able to shift course. And I would suggest in this postmodern era, there's a fly here, I would suggest that in this postmodern era, where so many of our systems and institutions are 10,000 miles off the mark before we even set foot in them, because of the past centuries of collective disconnection and dislocation from soul, soil, and society. The need has never been greater for each of you, the DRB graduates, you who have already presciently and courageously chosen to focus on cultivating wisdom and virtue, and to remain committed to this work of alignment and realignment, both personal and collective. So how do we keep Master Wa's wisdom close at hand as a daily practice in order to make continual adjustments when we're just a few inches or yards off and not 10,000s of miles? In my own more recent journey back to myself, I myself have found 3 helpful strategies. First, move at the pace of bodily guidance or internal wisdom. And by that, I mean it's the opposite of move fast and break things. I used to live a good chunk of my life right here in my head and to ignore the residue of the intelligence that was building up elsewhere in my being. But in a world that's speeding up exponentially, it's critical to slow down our external work long enough to feel the body and attune to the subtle energetic signs that something is out of whack, whether through meditation, as you all know, movement, or simple silence. As we know, our bodies keep the score of our internal misalignments. A few weeks ago, I was at a powerful talk by a renowned person who was speaking about overcoming trauma through resilience. And the first step in his 5-step plan towards resilience was to accept the pain. He asked people to remember their dates of traumatization, the dates where their lives changed forever, either through the loss of a loved one or something else. Because everyone has a date, he said, and they can recite the date without thinking. Many people in the room raised their hands, reciting their dates. But I was sitting there realizing, or at least feeling, that not everybody has a date or has experienced the kind of acute trauma that he was talking about. And they can't recognize, much less name their pain. He wasn't speaking to the kind of low-level structural trauma that many people feel every day in a postmodern society that is out of whack and possibly at an inflection point, transitioning to an undefined reality still to come. It's not surprising in this environment that chronic medical illness is rising, as is chronic inflammation, autism or neurodivergency, and mental health issues, all of which may be canaries in the coal mines or shamanic insights. Many people's minds and bodies are literally rejecting our environment. But in such cases of chronic trauma, we don't have a single incident or date or even awareness to point it on. Our society has gotten pretty good at metabolizing, integrating, and even paying homage to the acute trauma stories. So much so that I heard a recent TED Talk, it was really powerful, on the rise of the trauma essay in college applications. That's because such stories of individual resilience in the face of acute trauma can challenge and inspire us without undermining systemic structures. But stories of rising and deeper chronic ailments point to something more fundamentally out of whack, something that our institutions can't yet face. And yet, we need to remain keenly aware. Remember the frog in the slowly warming water? So often, if we're not paying close attention, we don't notice the rising heat. We ignore the chronic conditions and the toxic accumulations before the ailments turn acute and fatal. But our bodies deeply know when we need to slow down, to metabolize, or shift course because we're off by more than a few inches, either individually or collectively. We need to allow space for that attunement and to move at this pace of bodily guidance. So that's the first little trick I've learned. Second, focus on people and relationships, not projects. I've started realizing that if we are working with virtuous people, or at least virtue aspirants, as we cultivate our talents and energies, it often doesn't matter what we do. And what we do will almost inevitably be both nourishing and impactful in often unexpected ways. But if we're focused largely on what we do rather than who we do it with, and if we choose people who will further our sense of our projects or our projected needs, then the whole is almost inevitably less than the sum of the parts. It can even sometimes lead to affirmative harm because of the transactional nature of the relationships. Third, bloom where you're planted and remain connected to place, land, and soil. As important as it is to plant seeds of virtue wherever we go, it's also important to remain rooted in place so as to see and learn from a single cycle and ecosystem in a certain location with a manageable scale. We're each entangled with particular life energies, and we have to joyfully work at those places of entanglement. No matter how much we scatter and travel and scramble and seek to scale, a good part of our work must remain accountable and rooted to land and place, whether ancestral or adopted. Now, remember, everything in our modern world will conspire to make these three strategies, and the many strategies I'm sure each of you have learned while you've been here, difficult. A society built on and fueled by disconnection is not one that easily creates space for the work of alignment, much less accountability. But we must persevere. As J. Krishnamurti said, it's no measure of health to be well-adjusted in a profoundly sick society. As frogs living in ponds that may be overheated all around us, let's remember not to get too attached to the waters we collectively swim in. So, above all, I would say this: love, laugh, and let go. Choose life, in other words, over the familiar but decayed or decaying. And maybe, if we all do that, we'll find our way to build new ponds and new oceans of water along new versions of Compassion Way, Protector Avenue, and Filial Avenue. So we're counting on each of you, the class of 23 graduates of wisdom and virtue. May your cultivated and sustained powers of discernment and courage be blessings to our world and to all of us. Thank you so much.